I've been using the Accu-Wedge system now for about a year, and in that time frame I produced thousands of wedges and several hundred segmented rings using the Accu-Wedge system, all the way from 5 or 6 segments per ring up to 96 segments per ring, all with perfect joints. In order to achieve these perfect wedges and therefore perfect segmented rings, I've investigated a number of the operational and setup parameters for the Accu-Wedge system to ensure its optimum performance. This video will complement my previous videos on the Accu-Wedge system. I'll describe the setup parameters for the bandsaw in the Accu-Wedge system and also the operational parameters for the Accu-Wedge system to ensure its optimum performance and to ensure that you obtain perfect wedges and therefore perfect segmented rings for your segmented wood turning projects. It's very important when using the Accu-Wedge system to use at least 3/4 inch wide blades on your bandsaw. And I prefer 10 to 14 teeth per inch on my bandsaw blade. Again, the more teeth per inch, the finer the cuts and the less sanding you need to do on your surfaces to get perfect glue joints. The reason for the 3/4 inch wide blades is to eliminate bandsaw blade drift. When I'm cutting wood with the grain or at 90 degrees to the grain, we see no bandsaw blade drift. But when you're cutting at this oblique angle, there's more tension on one side of the blade than on the other. And that change in tension on the sides of the blade can cause that blade to drift ever so slightly in one direction. And it doesn't take much to cause that bandsaw blade to drift, and as a result you get inaccurate wedges off the system. By going to the 3/4 inch wide blades, putting each at 3/4 inch tension on your gauge on your bandsaw, you can eliminate that blade drift and get perfect wedges from your system. The next thing is to make sure this bandsaw blade is perfectly perpendicular to your Accu-Wedge system. I'm not concerned about the blade being perpendicular to the table, the bandsaw blade table, but it needs to be perfectly perpendicular to the Accu-Wedge table. And this may mean that you need to get underneath your bandsaw, loosen the clamps on your table, tilt the bandsaw blade, and true it in till it's perfectly perpendicular between the bandsaw blade and your Accu-Wedge table. Next thing to consider are your blade guides. And two issues I'm concerned about here. Number one, this back guide that rides on this back edge of this bandsaw blade should be touching the blade itself. This will minimize this inner movement. If I push this hard, I can actually see that blade move, just exaggerating a little bit there. But when that happens, sometimes if you did that and you push real fast, you can get that blade to move, and you get instead of getting a cut right where you want it, it might be off to one side or the other. So you can get more accurate cuts by keeping that bandsaw, that blade guide against the back of the blade, both on the top and the bottom guides. Likewise, the side guides, in these cases I have ceramic guides on my Laguna, I keep those riding flush against the blade, and that keeps the blade nice and tight that it doesn't move at all. And then finally, I want to keep this blade guide as low as possible, this top blade guide. This does two things. Number one, it keeps the blade tighter so it doesn't move. It also protects the blade so you have less chance of getting your fingers in there. It's a safer way of cutting woods with the Accu-Wedge system. So I like to keep that as low as possible, just making sure that it doesn't interfere with your clamps once your clamps are on there. One of the next issues to be concerned about are the roller bearings on the Accu-Wedge system. And you'll see this because you'll be cutting wedges for a while, and all of a sudden you'll start seeing this jerky motion, something like, hindering, something's going on there. And what that is that's sawdust getting embedded in the roller bearings on the Accu-Wedge system. On the Accu-Wedge system, there is a blade guard. And the purpose of this blade guard is to protect sawdust from getting into the roller bearings, but it can still go around and get in there. So you still see sawdust getting into these bearings. And what happens when you look at the bearings, you'll actually see sawdust impregnated in these roller surfaces. And it needs to be cleaned off. And simply a cloth wet with some water and just wipe those bearings off is all required. Don't use any solvent like acetone or anything, because these are plastic and the acetone will eat the plastic. So just use plain water to wipe those off. And it's mainly just these two front bearings. These back two usually don't see an issue. And at the same time, take your rag and wipe this groove on the rail on the Accu-Slice system, just to clean that from any sawdust. And when you put the system back on, it will be nice and smooth once again. The next area to address are the fences on the Accu-Wedge system. It consists of a pivot point screw in the back. This is the screw you loosen to change the relative position to select your number of segments. And then in front of that, there's a pin which drops into these set points to adjust your correct angle. And to show this operates, I'm going to go ahead and take this off. There's a screw in the back that is your pivot point, and there's one up front that has a nut underneath. I want you don't lose that. And when I take this off, you can see this indexing pin on the bottom. And that pin can be adjusted up or down. There's a screw inside here, and you can use that to adjust the relative height of this pin. And you want this pin that it rides in the hole, but when it's clamped down, you want to make sure this fence is flat against the table. You don't want this fence that it can tilt on you and move. That might give you an inaccurate cut. So that's it. Factory adjust it when you get it, but you may need to adjust it in the future if you so need it. So you can adjust those pins up or down, or you can even actually raise it up to not even use it. If you wanted to use wedges or adjust a different angle, you can bring this pin up, bring it up above the bottom of the rail, and not even use it. So that is an option also. So let me go and put this back on. And once you adjust your angle, then you tighten this. You don't need to tighten it too much. I mean, just enough to hold it in position. But this, if you look at the gap, there should be no gap between the table and the rail, so that this thing doesn't rock. And you see this doesn't rock at all. It's nice and solid. I select my angles for my wedges. A lot of work I've been doing lately. I've been doing it at 48 segments per ring, which works quite nicely. So you can feel these, they'll click in position, and they should be nice and straight. And if you have some wedges or some wedges, you can use your wedges to check the angle. But we found these things to be perfect. In fact, they're probably, if not as good, probably even better than the wedges as far as calibration. These index pins positions are precision machined or a CNC mill, and they're extremely accurate. My machinist who developed this assured me of that, and it's been proven to me many, many times that these things are very, very accurate. Okay, the next thing I'm going to do is make sure your Accu-Wedge table is close but not touching the bandsaw blade. You don't want those teeth chewing up the edge of your Accu-Wedge table. So you want it close but not quite touching. Likewise, your ramp should be reasonably close to the blade but not touching. And actually have my ramp below the table height. I find that actually works better. So I just bend it down a little bit. And so you can adjust this position with your Accu-Slice table. Release your mag jig clamps, adjust the position, and then make sure you lock the mag jig clamps back in position. What these mag jig clamps do is they clamp the Accu-Slice table to the bandsaw table. And by doing that, you minimize vibration. If you perchance run your system and forget to lock the mag jigs and clamp, you'll see a more ragged cut on your wedges. So it's important you keep those mag jigs activated on both sides of the Accu-Slice table. Well, the next thing to be concerned about is the boards you're cutting. It's quite important they be perfectly square on the edges. In other words, this surface to this surface. If they're not, and you put on the Accu-Wedge table, you might get some rocking motion. And if you get this rocking motion, one cut's not going to be the same as the next. So I run my boards through my, either my planer or my drum sander, and then I run my other edge on my edge sander to make sure it's perfectly perpendicular to this surface. And then run it through my, my sander again to make sure both edges are exactly the same distance apart. And when I do that, my boards are perfectly straight, perfectly perpendicular as far as the cross-sectional area, and I get no rocking motion on my boards, so they're nice and tight. One of the most difficult cuts to do when making wedges are wedges to come to a perfect point in the center, so there's no center opening or center gap in your segmented disc. This is a very difficult cut to make. In fact, it's near impossible on a table saw. It can be done on the Accu-Wedge system, but it must be done very carefully. The problem is when you're cutting with the blade, if there's not wood on both sides of the blade, it's going to cause that blade to drift. Now, this edge is going to cause the blade to move, in this direction instead of straight like you want it to do. So it's very important you first start your cut, you have wood on both sides of the blade. And what that means is, I usually do it by feel. I can feel the teeth on my bandsaw blade. I want to make sure when I start my very first cut that I have wood on both sides of the bandsaw blade. But it can be done, but it's very critical. If you move it too far to the side, you can see what's going to happen. It's going to cause this kind of a drift. And you don't want that to happen. So it's very important you have wood on both sides of the blade. One of the next things to be concerned about is the Accu-Stop system itself. In particular, this front surface of the Accu-Stop. It's important that surface be parallel to your Accu-Wedge table and parallel to the path of travel of the Accu-Wedge system. So what I normally do is I can try and just visually make sure that surface is parallel to my table, and then if I put my board edge against there and then clamp it down with my clamp, and if I go across the surface, I can feel the same tension across that surface of the Accu-Stop system. The other thing I do, I always position my board that I'm cutting, and I get my point to hit in the center of the Accu-Stop. By doing that, I ensure that I'm always in position, that even if it would be off, a slight amount, it doesn't matter because I'm always hitting the same point on the Accu-Stop system. So my boards will always be the same width. It's very critical that the boards be the same width, because if they're not, even if you're off by a few thousandths of an inch, your wedges won't be perfect. So I want to get that position always the same, so you're always hitting the exact same position. Again then, just to summarize, that surface must be parallel to the table, and always position your board in the center of the Accu-Stop. And then clamp in position, just lightly touching the Accu-Stop, not pushing too hard that you move the Accu-Stop, and then pushing the board against the fence and against the table, and then locking it in position. Okay, I'm going to run a couple boards here just to show the operation of the system and combine everything I've been describing so far. Again, I lowered my guides that are close. Again, I keep my fingers further away from that bandsaw blade, making it much safer, and gives me a sturdier cut. I position my wood against my Accu-Stop, hitting it in the center of the Accu-Stop, pushing the wood against the fence, against the table, and then locking it down lightly with my clamp. And again, being careful, don't push too hard. You don't want to move that Accu-Stop. So you just need to touch it lightly and then lock it down in place. And we're ready to take our first cut. Now it's important you're taking your cut, you move slowly through the bandsaw blade, especially when you first make your initial cut. The slower you go through the blade with the wood, the smoother your cut's going to be. So, cut. Now notice I've marked this line on my board, and I do that so I always know where the top surface of my board is. When I'm cutting on the Accu-Wedge system, I always keep that line up, going from one side to the next. Next thing I do, on this edge I just cut, there's a little bit of a fuzzy. And that fuzzy could give an inaccurate reading. So what I usually do is just take some sandpaper and just lightly sand off that fuzzy. So when I move it to the other side, move it against the Accu-Stop, again the same thing. Lightly touching the Accu-Stop, clamp it in position against the fence, against the table, and then we're ready to cut once again. Now these wedges I'm cutting are pretty small. These are just going to be 48 segments per ring. So it's a small ring, and it's going to be about, I think it's about 3 inches in diameter. So they're very, very small wedges. Now notice once again I just wipe my edge. I do use the Accu-Path laser. That tells me exactly where the blade is going to cut, so that's a nice feature that I find invaluable for operation of the Accu-Wedge system, and knowing exactly where I'm going to cut, making sure that I cut on the right side, and if perchance I try and do this, I know right away I'm on the wrong side of the cut, because I can see it right on with my laser beam. Also on the clamps, I use one clamp per side, and I actually, in this case, since my board is higher than my fence, I'd use a spacer underneath to adjust the height, and I'm clamping pretty much on this outer edge. Again, it's better to clamp on the outer edge than the inner edge. If you clamp on the inner edge, you might get a little bit of rocking motion. By clamping on the outer edge, it's definitely more stable. One next thing to be concerned about, as your board starts getting short, it may create some problems. Here's a shorter board, just an example. And what can happen is, number one, it's close to your guides for one, but because the blade's so short, you're not holding as much, you might get this kind of movement. So it's important when you get to a very small piece of wood at the very end, you watch you don't get this kind of movement of your wood. Make sure it's clamped position, but make sure also that your clamp doesn't hit your blade guides, because I do have a kind of low here. One final thought: if you're seeing some issues and you're not getting perfect joints on your system, instead of using wood, get some 3/4 inch MDF, cut some strips, and make wedges with those. That's how I first found I was getting blade drift. When I was cutting some wood samples with 1/2 inch blades, I wasn't getting perfect rings. And when I made some MDF rings, they're always perfect. And that's when I realized that the blade drift was due to the grain of the wood. So if you're thinking you're having an issue, just get some MDF strips and test some test strips, and that might tell you if the problem is your wood, or you're not clamping tight enough, you're getting movement by not hitting the exact same position in the Accu-Stop, or you're getting the blade's not tensioned enough, or you're getting some blade drift. So if an issue comes up, try some MDF strips. Okay, I'm working on a project here where I'm making a bunch of 48 segments per ring using some walnut and maple alternating woods. I made a number of these. And I'm also going to make some solid disc, which I'm going to put a spacer in. So this is actually 48 segments per ring, and I put 48 spacers. So it's actually 96 pieces of wood per ring in this segmented ring. And you see the joints are perfect. So the procedure here is, when you get a wedge, you have to sand off these fuzzies. You have a rough edge here where it cuts out the end of the bandsaw, and then you can have a little bit of fuzzies, particularly on the bottom edge where it cuts off. So you got to sand those off. And then you just require something with a 220 grit sandpaper, just sanding off those edges. That easy. And then I type, just to check things, I can measure these. So for example, this is 0.197 inches. Here's some others I cut. 0.197. 0.198. 0.197. And 0.197. And also check from top to bottom. 197, 196 and a half. 197, well actually 197. So that just shows that your bandsaw blade is perpendicular to your table. So the fact that these wedges are all exactly the same width, when I put those together, I'll get perfect wedges and perfect segmented rings. One additional thought, if you do produce a ring and you see a minor gap, you can adjust for that gap a little bit. Usually it's not much, but what I've done, if I had a gap on the outside edge, when I sand my disc, I would sand and put more pressure on the inside of the disc. If I had a gap on the inside, then I put more pressure on the outside. So you can adjust a little bit if you have some minor, fluctuations. But normally I don't even have to do that. Normally my rings are right on. As long as I set my system up and tune it right. I mean, these are 4 discs I just made actually on 2 days ago, and they're all perfect. There's some other applications for the Accu-Wedge system, some of which we've shown and some of which will be available in the near future. One of the things we did on one of our previous videos, I made these trapezoid-shaped segmented rings. So instead of these segments being perpendicular, they're at an angle. And I did this by tilting the bandsaw table. So instead of the table being 90 degrees to your Accu-Wedge table, I tilted it 10 degrees, and that's how I got these wedges. And there's another video described this in detail, how I did it and how it works. The other thing we've done, we're working on a new jig now to produce open segmented rings on the Accu-Wedge system. So you don't need any special jigs to get alignment and gluing. Your segments become slotted on the Accu-Wedge system. And this is a typical ring that I made. Another one I made where I have different depths to give me like a wave pattern around a segmented disc. And another example here where I have double cuts, one on top and one on the bottom of a segmented ring. Again, this requires no glue up jigs, just it's all your regular segments cut on the Accu-Wedge system. Finally, one thing you can do is you can raise up these index pins on the Accu-Wedge system so they do not lock into the alignment pinholes on the Accu-Wedge table. And then you can use your own angle jigs. You can make special alignment jigs. You could use wedgies themselves. You could take these and use a wedgie instead of doing it this position. Move them over and do an angle position to get a different effect on your projects. Or do some other unique angle such as 23 segments per ring that could easily be done just by raising up those index pins and then position these fences wherever you want them. A final note, if you have any special questions or concerns or even a possible new application for the Accu-Wedge system, please let us know. We'd like to hear from you. We're always looking for ways to improve the system and to convey that knowledge to our other customers to help everybody make better segmented wood turning projects.